Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Tom Hellick. This week, President Trump calls for a significant increase in military spending.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
In his first budget, President Donald Trump wants to boost defense spending by $54 billion, a 10% increase. He'll likely find congressional support. The defense budget has been cut in recent years, and many lawmakers from both parties say they are concerned about the country's military readiness. But even with the cutbacks, the United States still spends far more on defense than any other country in the world. In fact, more than many other countries combined. A husband and wife who are both career national newspaper reporters have written a new book that makes the argument that for generations, America has been addicted to war. Molly Sinclair McCartney is a journalist whose career as a newspaper reporter spanned more than 30 years, including 10 years at the Miami Herald and 14 years at the Washington Post. You co-authored this book with your late husband, James McCartney, titled America's War Machine, Vested Interests, Endless Conflicts. Jim was writing the book when he died 5 years ago, and you stepped in and completed it. And now you've been traveling the country with the book signings, and giving lectures, including a recent lecture at Concordia University in Montreal, which is what brings you to our studios here at Mountain Lake PBS. Molly, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Jim spent much of his career as a newspaper reporter covering national security, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the numerous conflicts in the Middle East. In 1961, he was working at the Chicago Daily News, and he covered President Eisenhower's final speech as a president. And it was part of that speech that Jim picked up on, and a number of people did, where he warned of what he called the potential for the disastrous rise of the military-industrial complex.
Right.
What is the military-industrial complex?
Well, this is the question Jim had. He covered the speech in 1961, as you said, and he came away sort of scratching his head saying, what is this guy talking about? Now, Jim had been in the military, so he knew something about it. He'd been in World War II as sort of a teenage soldier on the front lines in Europe. And so he was familiar with the military, but the idea of a military-industrial complex was something that was like, I don't know what this is. But as a reporter in Washington, he was in a position to ask questions and get answers. So he spent the next several months after that speech going around, researching it, talking to people, pulling information together, and developed a 5-part series, which ultimately ran splashed across the top of the front page of the Chicago Daily News, a series explaining it. The headline I love most from that series was this tug of war we have as a result of the military-industrial complex. Because what Eisenhower was talking about was when you have a large standing army, as we have had since World War II, and you have an armaments industry that makes money off the armaments they sell to the military and to other countries around the world, there is a push for war that must be guarded against. This is what worried Eisenhower as a military man, and it's what Jim ultimately, in his research, reported on in that 5-part series, which, by the way, led to him being selected to spend a year at Harvard University as a Nieman Fellow, digging deeper into this issue, and coming away from that and his other reporting that he did over many years with the conclusion that there is an addiction to war in this country as a result of these forces, not only from the military and from the defense contractors, but from the other players that have emerged since Eisenhower made that speech. And I'm referring to Congress, which is in a search for votes and campaign contributions, will vote for weapons that the Pentagon sometimes doesn't even want.
Because it provides jobs.
That is often the argument, that let's have these defense contractors build these weapons because it's good jobs for our community. But the fact is that the University of Massachusetts and other studies have found that you get more jobs from non-defense spending than you get from defense spending. So if you take $1 million, which is what they did, or maybe it was $1 billion, You take that amount of money and you see in their study how many jobs you get if you put it into the defense industry, and then you compare that to what you get in the number of jobs in education, health, clean energy, and some other areas. And every single category, more jobs from the non-defense spending. Meanwhile, you have a defense industry that is very clever about how they spread out the jobs. They make sure that if an airplane is being built, that there are pieces of it built in as many congressional districts and states as possible, because that leads to insurance that there will be approval by Congress for those programs. You would know if there is a safe vote for anybody in Congress, it's voting for the defense establishment and the weapons. This is a problem that we as a country need to really think about.
And Jim was one of the first and only reporters really to start reporting on that?
He was certainly one who did it over many years and dug very deep and was very skeptical based on his own experience in the military and his reporting from what he could see happening in front of his eyes. He had a front row seat to history, and he saw the evolution of this expansion and how it affected our defense policies, our national security decisions, our war and peace decisions, how we got into Iraq because of this push, along with other things, the ideology, the flawed intelligence, or perhaps we should say the failed intelligence or the exaggerated intelligence that was used in the case of the weapons of mass destruction, the argument that they were there when they weren't. All of this leads to a push in that direction. What we have done and the pattern that has evolved is to use the military as a way to manage the world, to use the military when military cannot solve political problems, as we've seen in the Middle East over and over again. The military can go in and they can take out the existing government, and then what happens?
Jim makes the argument that this war machine is behind just about every war and conflict since dating back to before the Cold War?
Since World War II, when the Cold War started. He's not the only one who says this. There's a great deal of literature, many books, many scholars who've made this argument. Andrew Bacevich being one of the more recent ones who talks about sort of endless war since World War II in the Middle East. That it's not a series of little wars, it's just one long perpetual war, which has really not gotten us very far. I mean, we have intervened repeatedly and it has not worked well.
And do most Americans think that over this half century that these have been necessary interventions that have made the world safer and made the United States safer?
Well, I think what you have is a public that's very tired of these wars. At the same time, there are those who believe the U.S. should be the world policeman, impose democracy, even though the people where we're trying to impose democracy don't want it, don't have the infrastructure to support it, have a tribal tradition rather than the kind of traditions that we have evolved in this country. So it's a slippery slope.
Jim was one of the reporters who, back in 2003, where you talked about Secretary of State Powell went to the United Nations, made the argument to the case to invade Iraq because of the evidence of either nuclear or biological or chemical weapons. And was he early on a critic of that, and he thought that was faulty?
This is what happened, and it was amazing to me to see. Now, this would have 2003. Jim had been out of daily journalism since 1990. Although he had been writing magazine articles, he was writing a local column and continued to do that up until he died in 2011. So he was very active and very informed on what was happening. So we are sitting in our living room watching Colin Powell address the United Nations because we wanted to see what he had to say. The expectation was he was going to explain why Bush wanted to invade Iraq. And we're listening, and at the end of this presentation, Jim stood up and said, "They have nothing. They have a picture of a building. They don't know what's in the building. They don't know what they're getting into. This is going to be a disaster." And I was struck by how he had concluded this, but he had been involved in these issues for so long that he could read the tea leaves in a way that other people couldn't. And of course, he was absolutely right. That's what led him to start working on the book, which he was well into when he died. Now, after he died, at his memorial service, one of the women came over and said, "What's going to happen to that book? You have to finish it." So I did.
It was important to you to finish his work.
I wasn't sure at first if I could do it. Certainly I knew it was important, but I didn't know if I had enough material to finish it. So I started by sending it off to the guy he had worked for at Knight Ridder, who'd been his sort of bureau boss, and said, is there enough here for a book? And he read it. Also, I wanted to make sure the premise was solid, that there was enough material to make the case. So I sent it off, and it came back, and he said, "The guts are here. You have a lot of work to do."
So that was over the next few years is what you've been doing.
So I was fortunate to get a Wilson Center appointment in Washington to do the research to finish the book and the interviews. And then, of course, the writing and editing and all the other stuff you do.
You add a lot of context. You also provide a lot of examples of where the defense budget is so bloated and where it's continued to grow after some cutbacks in the 1990s, which we felt here in Plattsburgh with the closing of Plattsburgh Air Force Base and bases across the country. The military budget, especially after 9/11, has just continued to grow.
Blew up. If you look at the total expenditures across the country, there wasn't that much of a decline in the 90s. Yes, there was a slight decline, but it wasn't all that much. You felt it more here because of what was happening. But the chart shows it really never dropped that much. And of course, in 9/11, it just exploded. The Congress could not throw enough money at it because of the panic over 9/11.
And are they still today because of ISIS and other concerns?
There is still a great deal of money spent because of the ISIS and the fears, and I would like to make this point about that as well. There's 24/7 news cycle about the terrorism, which leads everybody to think, well, it's all over, they're coming, they're going to get me tomorrow, when in fact the terrorists win when we overreact. I would say there's a very good case to be made for having overreacted since 9/11 in the money we spend, in the expansion of Homeland Security, in military actions around the world. The money spent since 9/11, which has just ballooned and created enormous overspending in many cases, is something we really need to think about and to adjust. The problem is the imbalance in the way we spend the money. We spend 10 times as much on the Pentagon as the State Department. So instead of using our diplomats as effectively as we could, we're putting so much more onto the military side, which even the guys at the top of the brass in the Pentagon will tell, and have said this publicly. There's an imbalance. There's too much being spent there. You should spend more on the other side. We spend more on our defense and national security than the next 8 big spenders combined. Add up everything the next 8 big spenders spend, and we still spend more.